Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Saturday, January 10th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. Tomorrow's forecast for Riverside calls for a high of 69.8 degrees and a low dipping to 47.5 degrees, so layer up if you're heading out early. Coming up on the show, we'll examine the factors fueling widespread protests and intense political clashes in the wake of a deadly shooting by ICE agents. We'll also break down how President Trump's sweeping immigration reforms are leaving refugees stuck in uncertain legal limbo. Plus, other key stories from around the world. All this and more, right here on Alex's News. Stay tuned. Our top story this morning is out of Minneapolis, where a fatal ICE shooting has sparked protests across the country. Reporter Ethan Morales is with us. Ethan, take us back to that morning earlier this week and explain what happened.
This all unfolded Thursday morning, January 7th, during what Homeland Security called the largest immigration enforcement operation ever in the Twin Cities. According to PBS NewsHour, roughly 2,000 federal agents flooded neighborhoods, and 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good was there as a volunteer legal observer, blowing a whistle to alert neighbors when ICE showed up. She was sitting in her burgundy Honda Pilot on a residential street in South Minneapolis, partly blocking a narrow roadway as unmarked federal vehicles tried to get through. Within minutes, an ICE Special Response Team agent, Jonathan Ross, walked up to her window, and that confrontation ended with 3 shots fired and Good mortally wounded.
Were agents actually targeting her, or did this start as something more routine?
Federal officials say she was not the target of an arrest, but that she was interfering with their operation by blocking the road and following their vehicles. In videos reviewed by outlets like The New York Times and The Guardian, you can see Ross approach while Good sits in the driver's seat, talking calmly and filming. She tells him, quote, "That is fine, dude. I am not mad at you," end quote, just before agents order her to get out of the car. Moments later, her SUV moves slightly, then begins a slow turn as if to leave, and that is when Ross fires through the windshield and driver's side window.
Federal officials are calling this self-defense. What exactly is their argument?
ICE and the Department of Homeland Security say Good turned her vehicle into a weapon, and that Ross believed she was trying to run him over. DHS officials, including Secretary Kristi Noem, have stressed his past trauma last summer. In a separate case near Bloomington, Ross was dragged about 100 yards by a fleeing suspect and needed more than 30 stitches, something CBS News says the White House keeps highlighting. Noem has described Good as, quote, stalking, end quote, the agents, and even framed the encounter as, quote, domestic terrorism, end quote. And just yesterday, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt escalated that language, calling Good a, quote, leftist insurrectionist, end quote, who was purposefully and illegally obstructing law enforcement.
But a lot of these videos seem to show something different. What are independent analysts seeing?
A detailed reconstruction by the New York Times, backed up by the Washington Post and the Guardian, slowed down bystander and agent footage frame by frame. Their analysis concluded Ross was not directly in front of the SUV when he fired. The wheels were turned away, and the vehicle was angling out of the area, not bearing down on him. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, after watching the videos, told PBS that the self-defense claim was, quote, bullshit, end quote, and called it reckless use of power. Human Rights Watch, cited by Truthout, pointed out that audio captured Good trying to de-escalate, while her wife later summed it up starkly, quote, we had whistles, they had guns, end quote.
Remind us who Renee Good was, beyond that awful 47 seconds of video.
She was a local poet, a mother of 3 children, and a United States citizen who had done legal observation and community support work during past protests. Her family and neighbors told PBS she saw herself as a protector, especially for immigrant and black families who panic when unmarked vehicles and officers suddenly flood their blocks. According to CBS and local outlets, a GoFundMe page for her children and her wife Becca raised roughly $1.5 million in just 3 days before organizers shut it down, saying the family's immediate needs were met. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who represents the district, called the killing, quote, state violence, end quote, and said it showed how far enforcement has drifted from basic human rights.
How did the neighborhood react in those first hours and days?
Protests started almost immediately. That same evening, more than 1,000 people marched through South Minneapolis, demanding that ICE leave the city and that Ross be arrested, according to CBS News reporting from the scene. Demonstrators shouted directly at federal agents, with one protester heard on PBS saying, quote, "You are destroying our communities. Just leave," end quote. Within a day, activists had set up makeshift barricades of pallets and debris around the shooting site to keep federal vehicles out, something The Guardian says DHS is now labeling a security threat rather than a vigil.
City officials are clearly angry as well. What is Mayor Frey saying about ICE's presence in Minneapolis?
Frey has tried to push back on the idea that Minneapolis as a whole is lawless, saying the chaos is tied to this federal operation. In one striking line reported by PBS, he said, quote, 50% of the shootings that have happened thus far in Minneapolis this year have been ICE. We are a safe city. ICE is making it less so, end quote. That is a political shot at Washington, but it is also his way of telling residents that the bullets they are hearing are not primarily from local crime, they are from federal agents. Governor Tim Walz has backed him up, warning about what he called a federal, quote, propaganda machine, end quote, trying to justify the killing.
There was also that confrontation at Roosevelt High School the same day. What happened on that campus?
Later on Thursday, ICE agents chased a man they say was interfering with their work, and that chase ended right outside Roosevelt High in South Minneapolis. DHS claims a person posing as a teacher assaulted officers, but a parent and teacher named Nicole Lundheim told Fox 9 and other local stations a very different story. She says agents pushed and grabbed her while she tried to shield students and film, describing the scene as pure chaos in a place kids are supposed to feel safe. The district was so rattled that Minneapolis Public Schools shut down in-person classes on Friday and kept them remote through at least mid-February, which PBS NewsHour says is fueling fear among immigrant and black students who now associate school with possible raids.
And this is spread beyond Minnesota. Talk about what happened in Portland.
The next day, Friday, Border Patrol agents in Portland, Oregon shot and wounded 2 people during what DHS describes as a traffic stop involving undocumented immigrants tied to a Venezuelan gang. Portland's mayor, Keith Wilson, called the shooting, quote, reckless, end quote, and publicly aligned himself with Minneapolis leaders, saying these tactics were not welcome in his city. Police Chief Bob Day emphasized that local officers only helped secure the perimeter and were not involved in immigration enforcement, trying to distance city law enforcement from the federal team. Protests broke out there as well, with PBS and WEDA noting that for many residents, the Minneapolis killing and the Portland shooting feel like parts of the same nationwide escalation.
Let's turn to the investigation into Renee Good's death. Who is actually in charge of this case right now?
Initially, the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped in and essentially told Minnesota's own Bureau of Criminal Apprehension to stand down, cutting off state access to evidence by Friday, according to the Star Tribune. That move triggered what local media are calling a jurisdictional brawl. Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty announced she is launching an independent state investigation anyway, stressing that this killing happened on Minnesota soil and saying, quote, the ICE officer does not have complete immunity here, end quote. She has even set up ways for the public to send her office videos and witness statements directly, bypassing federal filters.
How hard is it, legally, for a state prosecutor like Moriarty to bring criminal charges against a federal officer?
It is extremely hard. Legal analysts interviewed by the New Republic point to the Constitution's Supremacy Clause, which says federal law trumps state law, and to a Supreme Court case from the 1800s in Re Negal that basically shielded a federal marshal from state prosecution for actions taken in the line of duty. There is also a more recent example, the attempt to prosecute FBI sniper Lon Horiuchi over the Ruby Ridge siege in the 1990s, which a federal appeals court shut down unless prosecutors could prove clear malice, something they never did. On top of that, a federal statute allows officers to move cases into federal court, where judges are usually more receptive to arguments that they were just doing their jobs, so Moriarty and Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison face a very steep uphill climb.
And how has President Trump responded to Minnesota's push for its own investigation?
In White House comments yesterday, Trump dismissed state and local officials as, quote, crooked, end quote, and suggested he would normally share FBI evidence, but would not do it in this case. He also painted Minneapolis as a beautiful place being destroyed, which echoes how Fox News has framed the unrest as a Democratic failure rather than a federal overreach. At the same time, DHS has announced it is re-examining more than 5,000 refugee cases in Minnesota, which advocates see as retaliatory pressure on a state that is challenging federal authority. And according to PBS, immigration sweeps have continued in the Twin Cities, even as crowds keep gathering to mourn Good.
This is now a big fight in Congress, too. What are Democrats in Washington trying to do about ICE and DHS?
Progressives in the House are trying to use the power of the purse, the constitutional control over spending, to go after ICE's budget. Fox News correspondent Chad Pergram reports that lawmakers like Jasmine Crockett and Jamie Raskin are pushing to tie any new DHS funding to reforms or cuts, with Raskin saying Congress should use every means at its disposal. The ranking Democrat on Homeland Security, Benny Thompson, is demanding formal oversight hearings into the Minneapolis shooting and the broader operation behind it. Some on the left, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, are even saying they might be willing to risk a partial shutdown when funding runs out at the end of this month to force a confrontation over ICE's role.
Are party leaders actually willing to go that far, or are they tapping the brakes?
For now, top Democrats are cautious. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries has said his priority is renewing Affordable Care Act subsidies and keeping the government open, and he has explicitly avoided drawing a red line on ICE, according to NPR's Capitol Hill coverage. In the Senate, Chuck Schumer has acknowledged deep problems with ICE, but has sidestepped the question of abolishing or defunding the agency. Republicans, meanwhile, are slamming the shutdown talk. Speaker Mike Johnson calls it a terrible idea. Senator Eric Schmidt has labeled it, quote, weapons-grade stupid, end quote. And Minnesota's own Tom Emmer accuses Democrats of fueling anti-ICE violence, while Vice President J.D. Vance keeps framing Ross as a man simply defending his life.
Outside the Capitol, we are seeing coordinated protests this weekend under the banner, ICE Out for Good. What is that about?
Starting today, Saturday, January 10th, groups like Indivisible, Move On, the ACLU, Voto Latino, and United We Dream have launched what they call the ICE Out for Good weekend of action. Mobilize.us and NBC Palm Springs report more than 1,000 vigils, marches, and rallies planned through tomorrow, not only across the United States, but even overseas, including a Democrats Abroad vigil in France. In Minneapolis, thousands are converging on the intersection where Good was shot and on the Whipple Federal Building, demanding ICE be removed from the city and that Ross face charges. The Guardian and Citizen journalists have already documented tense standoffs near hotels housing ICE personnel, with federal officers firing pepper balls and chemical irritants at crowds they say are blocking access.
Stepping back from the protests, what does this moment tell us about where the country is on immigration enforcement?
It shows a huge and growing divide in how Americans see federal power. PBS's Fred DeSam Lazaro calls the Good shooting a flashpoint revealing the human cost of President Trump's ramped-up deportation agenda, especially in cities that already distrust law enforcement. Outlets like Fox frame the story as a law and order test that Democrats are failing, while places like Truthout and Al Jazeera focus on how raids and shootings are eroding trust in government and making immigrants afraid to send kids to school or go to the doctor. With the FBI investigation tightly controlled under Director Kash Patel, and no independent experts yet saying the shooting met DHS's own deadly force rules, legal scholars told the New Republic this could become a seismic case that reshapes how far federal agents can go and how much states can push back.
Before we let you go, Ethan, what are the immediate next steps people in Minneapolis should be watching for?
In the short term, we are likely to see parallel investigations move forward, the FBI's internal review and Hennepin County's attempt to build a state criminal case, possibly through a grand jury. Community groups are promising nightly vigils at the shooting site and say they will keep pressuring city officials not to cooperate with ICE operations. Minneapolis schools are trying to stabilize remote learning while counseling students who saw armed agents on their campus. And all of this is happening as federal officials reportedly prepare to send even more agents into the region, which many residents fear will only deepen the crisis rather than resolve it.
A lot to watch in the coming days. Ethan Morales, thanks for walking us through it. The Trump administration is in its second term now, and immigration is front and center again. Chloe, how different is this from what we saw during his first 4 years?
It is the same Trump worldview, but this time it is system-wide and much more coordinated. Vox and ProPublica describe it as taking all those earlier, sometimes chaotic experiments and welding them into one overarching plan that puts enforcement above everything else. Instead of scattered executive orders, you now have a deliberate push to seal the border, fast-track deportations, and narrow almost every legal pathway. And it is happening mostly through executive power, often racing ahead of Congress and, at times, even the courts.
When you say seal the border, what does that look like on the ground for people trying to claim asylum today?
According to NPR and Vox, asylum has gone from difficult to almost unreachable. U.S. law says if you reach the border and fear persecution for reasons like your politics or religion, you can ask for protection. But the administration now presumes most of those claims are fraudulent. So people are either turned back to Mexico immediately or flown to third countries they have never set foot in. Advocates tell Human Rights Watch that even very strong cases are getting swept aside in that rush to deny and remove.
Third countries they have never visited is a striking phrase. Where are people being sent?
The Washington Post reports the U.S. has cut deals with roughly 20 countries, from nearby places like Panama and Costa Rica to faraway nations such as South Sudan and Uganda. The idea is, if someone passes through or can be accepted there, the U.S. can put them on a plane and say, in effect, your protection claim is now someone else's problem. Lawyers say that makes court challenges much harder, because once people are off U.S. soil, they are outside the normal constitutional protections. Critics call this creating, quote, legal black holes, end quote, where people disappear into other nations, prisons, or refugee camps.
Officials point out that border crossings are way down. How are they explaining that drop?
Homeland Security points to what they call historic lows in encounters and releases at the southern border, and they say that proves deterrence is working. NPR notes that during the Biden years, numbers surged with people from Venezuela, Haiti, Central America, even India, learning routes through social media and WhatsApp groups. Under Biden, many were released while their asylum cases moved through backlogged courts, sometimes for years. Trump's team reversed that logic. Instead of, we will sort this out over time, the message became, we will presume your claim is invalid and move you out quickly.
One of the most controversial examples involves Venezuelans sent to a mega prison in El Salvador. Walk us through what happened there.
Early last year, within weeks of the inauguration, the administration put nearly 250,000 Venezuelan migrants onto planes and sent them to Sicat, El Salvador's giant maximum security prison. President Trump publicly called them, quote, the worst of the worst, end quote, and labeled them members of the Tren de Aragua gang. To justify skipping hearings, the Justice Department dusted off the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, a wartime law most associated with World War II. But joint investigations by ProPublica, CBS's 60 Minutes, and Venezuelan outlets found most of those people had no U.S. criminal convictions at all, and only a tiny handful were even accused of violent crimes.
So these were not the hardened criminals the administration described?
Right, the numbers simply did not match the rhetoric. Human Rights Watch and the group Cristosal reviewed records and found about half had no criminal history anywhere, not just in the U.S. Cato Institute analysts checked them against a Venezuelan and Interpol list of more than 1,400 confirmed gang members, and not a single deportee's name matched. Yet DHS Alien Enemy Validation Guides, which the ACLU pried loose in a lawsuit, showed agents using tattoos or even the common reggaeton phrase, real hasta la muerte, as supposed proof of gang ties, even when it was just a soccer logo or a tribute to someone's parents.
You mentioned those guides came up in court. What have judges said about this use of the Alien Enemies Act?
A federal judge here in Washington, James Boasberg, issued a temporary restraining order last March, saying the government could not just whisk people away without due process. According to court records summarized by the Washington Post, planes still took off within minutes of that order in some cases, which is why there are now contempt of court investigations underway. Then last May, the Supreme Court stepped in and, in Trump versus JGG, froze further use of the Alien Enemies Act in immigration cases, while lower courts examine whether it was misused. District judges have since sided with migrants in the vast majority of individual habeas cases, often finding violations of the Administrative Procedure Act.
The Venezuelan story took another twist this week when Nicolas Maduro was captured. How does that change things?
On Sunday, so just 6 days ago, U.S. forces helped capture Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, and pressured an interim government into place. Almost immediately, President Trump started talking about, quote, cherishing Venezuelans now that, in his view, the dictator is gone. But at the same time, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem moved to cancel temporary protected status for more than 700,000 Venezuelans in the U.S., arguing their country is now safe. Legal scholars told NPR that undercuts the idea these migrants were ever wartime enemies, and it has fueled calls to unwind those CECOT deportations completely.
Let's talk about the immigration courts themselves. How is the administration reshaping that system?
In addition to changing the rules, they are changing the referees. NPR's Ximena Bustillo reported that nearly 100 immigration judges, roughly 15% of the bench, were pushed out last year. Many of them were Biden-era appointees or judges known for granting asylum at higher rates. They have been replaced by new hires labeled deportation judges, including rotating cohorts of military lawyers, and their performance is now tied to how many cases they close, usually through removal orders.
What does that mean for people whose cases are still pending?
It means more pressure and fewer neutral eyes on complex stories. The National Association of Immigration Judges describes this as a political purge that turns a court system into what they call a deportation machine. Because quotas and new so-called accountability memos reward speed, judges are less able to spend time on evidence or bring in interpreters and experts. And for migrants, especially those without lawyers, that rushed environment can be the difference between winning protection and being sent back into danger.
San Francisco is one city feeling that shift very directly. What is happening to the court there?
The Justice Department has told staff it plans to shut down the San Francisco Immigration Court by early next year, January of 2027. At one point, that building handled around 120,000 cases from Northern California and Oregon. But after a wave of firings and retirements, NPR says it is now down to just 5 judges, roughly a quarter of what it had. Cases are being moved to a newer court in Concord, about 30 miles away, which advocates call a, quote, due process desert, end quote, because it is harder for volunteer lawyers and protesters to reach. That closure is happening while the national backlog has soared above 3.5 million cases, leaving people in a kind of legal limbo that can drag on for years.
Is this totally new? Or are there earlier examples of attorneys general reshaping the courts from the inside?
There is a clear through line. Back in 2018, courts documented how Attorney General Jeff Sessions used obscure powers to rewrite asylum law from his office, for example, by limiting claims based on domestic violence and gang threats. The Migration Policy Institute later warned that because immigration courts sit inside the Justice Department, any attorney general can pull cases to themselves and set binding precedents. What is different now, MPI analysts say, is the scale. It is not just rulings, but personnel purges, new job titles, and structural changes, all pointing toward enforcement first.
There must be a wave of lawsuits in response. What are the main accountability efforts right now?
You are seeing challenges on several fronts. Judge Boasberg ruled just before Christmas that the Venezuelans sent to CICOT were denied due process and ordered the government to present a plan for bringing them back or giving them real hearings. The Justice Department asked for more time and was rebuffed. Separately, a class action case by the Judges Union is before the Merit Systems Protection Board, arguing that firing nearly 100 judges for their asylum grant rates is an illegal, politically motivated purge. And on New Year's Eve, just about 10 days ago, another federal judge, Trina Thompson in California, voided the administration's attempt to cancel temporary protected status for certain nationalities, calling the rationale pretextual.
Some of the Venezuelans are also suing for damages, right?
Yes, at least one man, Adrian Ringel, has filed a Federal Tort Claims Act case seeking about $1.3 million. He and others describe beatings, sexual violence, and months of incommunicado detention inside CICOT, conditions Human Rights Watch has documented in detail. Those suits argue that by paying El Salvador around $6 million to hold people, the U.S. had misclassified as, quote, enemy aliens, end quote. The U.S. government effectively kept custody while outsourcing the abuse. And comments from officials like Border Czar Tom Homan, who reportedly said, quote, I do not care what the judges think, end quote, are now being cited as evidence that some violations were not just mistakes, but deliberate.
Human Rights Watch used very stark language about that prison. What did they find?
Their report last fall, titled, quote, You Have Arrived in Hell, end quote, lays out a pattern of torture, overcrowding, and humiliation. Researchers interviewed people like a gay makeup artist and a delivery driver who had no criminal records but were thrown into the same facility as suspected gang leaders. They described beatings, being denied medical care, and having no way to contact family or lawyers for months. And when many of them were eventually returned to Venezuela in a prisoner swap last summer, the Washington Post noted that U.S. officials quietly admitted none were considered high-value security threats.
With all this, some historians are drawing parallels to earlier chapters of U.S. history. What comparisons are you hearing?
Legal scholars keep going back to Japanese-American internment during World War II and the Supreme Court's infamous Korematsu decision. The Brennan Center's Catherine Yon Ebright points out that the Alien Enemies Act was used then to register and sometimes detain about 31,000 so-called enemy aliens. But even that happened during an officially declared war. Using the same law in peacetime to target people based on alleged gang ties is what she calls more radical. Others look at Haitian boat interdictions in the 1990s and say we are again creating offshore zones where normal rights do not fully apply, this time by scattering people among partner nations.
Globally, what does this mean for the broader refugee system? Is the U.S. still seen as a leader?
Many experts say that image is fading fast. With more than 100 million people displaced worldwide, Europe and Canada are also tightening rules. And Vox reports that Washington's hard line gives political cover for other governments to follow suit. The Migration Policy Institute has urged the U.S. to do the opposite, create more flexible legal channels for workers, modernize outdated visa caps from 1990, and build a less adversarial asylum process that can move quickly without abandoning fairness. But for now, the emphasis is on removals, and as ProPublica's Micah Rosenberg put it on a recent podcast, people who would have seen the U.S. as a last resort are being left in, quote, precarious situations, with no shining city on the hill, end quote, to turn to.
Finally, Chloe, with court cases moving and the situation in Venezuela changing so fast, could any of this be rolled back?
Some pieces almost certainly will be, because judges are already striking them down or forcing revisions. The capture of Maduro undercuts the legal theory that Venezuelan migrants are invading enemies, which may make it easier for courts to dismantle those CICOT deportations and restore protections like TPS. But the deeper shifts, The court culture, the third country deals, the message that asylum is basically closed, those can linger for years, even under a different president. Analysts at MP, I say that without real legislation from Congress, every administration will keep remaking the system by fiat, and people's fates will swing with the next election.
A huge amount to watch in the months ahead. Chloe, thanks for breaking it all down for us this morning. Here are some other headlines. In Iran, authorities have hit delete on dissent. Since the evening of January 8th, monitoring group NetBlock says nationwide connectivity has flatlined at about 1% of normal. The shutdown targets 12 days of protests that began over economic hardship but have swelled into calls to end the Islamic Republic. With international phone lines also throttled, rights groups estimate 65 to 72 people killed and more than 300 detained. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has denounced demonstrators as vandals. The Attorney General is threatening capital, enemy of God, charges, and analysts say this unprecedented blackout is hiding a deadly crackdown, even as exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi urges more strikes, and President Trump warns he'll hit Iran very hard if security forces keep firing. On Capitol Hill, the Trump-era legal drama is going prime time. House Judiciary Chair Jim Jordan plans to summon former special counsel Jack Smith for a public hearing as soon as this month, after a 9-hour closed deposition in December, whose transcript, released New Year's Eve, showed Smith insisting his now-abandoned Trump cases had proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Smith's team says he's eager to rebut what they call mischaracterizations, while Republicans vow to probe alleged weaponization of the Justice Department, including efforts to obtain lawmakers' phone records in a clash that could reshape rules for special counsel independence and congressional oversight. In domestic policy, the administration is putting the freeze on the safety net. On January 6th, it ordered a halt to about $10 billion in child care and social service funding for 5 Democratic-led states, including California and New York. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. says the move will root out fraud and stop money illicitly reaching undocumented immigrants. The pause hits the Child Care and Development Fund for roughly 1.3 million low-income children, along with TANF and social services block grants, prompting Democratic governors to denounce political retribution and U.S. District Judge Arun Subramanian to issue a 14-day restraining order while lawsuits race to keep family budgets from cracking. On elections, a federal judge has marked up the president's script. In a suit by Oregon and Washington, U.S. District Judge John Chun blocked key parts of an executive order that required documentary proof of citizenship to register and demanded that all mail ballots be received, not just postmarked, by Election Day. His 75-page ruling says the White House overreached into powers the Constitution gives Congress and the states, and bars the administration from using federal funds as leverage, preserving universal vote-by-mail systems that officials say would otherwise have disenfranchised more than 130,000 voters in the 2 states. And in Brazil, the soy story is taking a darker roast. Industry group ABIOVE, representing Cargill, Bunge, ADM, and other grain giants, has quit the Amazon soy moratorium after a new Mato Grosso law, effective January 1st, stripped roughly 4 billion reais, about $743 million, in tax breaks from companies sticking with the pact. Executives say the 2006 accord has fulfilled its historical role, but Environment Ministry advisor Andre Lima warns the walkout effectively ends it and undercuts Brazil's zero deforestation by 2030 pledge. The Amazon Environmental Research Institute projects soy-driven clearing could rise by up to 30% by 2045, putting exporters on a collision course with tough anti-deforestation rules in markets like the European Union. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King, with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.